Hello again, garden friends. Today I am breaking down composting for beginners. If you want to start composting but you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, then this video may help. I'm going to cut through all the heavy science of it and just tell you what you need to know to get started. First, what is compost? Why does everyone seem to be talking about it? And what are the benefits of using it? Compost is not the same thing as soil. Soil is composed of sand, silt, and clay particles and mostly comes from rocks breaking down over a long period of time. But if you were to go take a soil sample from your yard or a field or the forest, the total makeup of that sample would more than likely include a certain percentage of organic matter like compost. So what's the big deal? Why is compost so beneficial? The first thing is it reduces waste. We're making that compost from things like yard waste, fruit and vegetable scraps, and instead of disposing of them, we're using them to create something beneficial for our garden. It can also help improve soil structure. If you have really sandy soil that has trouble holding on to water, that organic matter can act like a sponge and help with water retention. If you have really heavy clay soil, those clay particles are really tiny and can compact together. When you add in things like compost, it kind of creates more pores between that soil and allows water to drain through a lot better. Compost is also full of beneficial microorganisms that are important for plant health. Compost can also give your plants nutrients and it makes a great mulch. So how do you compost? Well, just like there's a lot of different ways to successfully garden, there's a lot of different ways to successfully compost. 4 of the main methods are hot composting, cold composting, trench composting, and vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is using worms to break down that waste. Now you can absolutely have worms present in other types of composting, but it's a little bit of a different setup. Today I'm mainly going to talk about hot and cold composting because that's the methods I use, but because it's so beginner friendly, I'll touch on trench composting too. So what do you need to get started? If you're cold composting, honestly, you can just make a pile, but if you're worried about animals getting in, it might be better to have a container. Hot composting does a little bit better when it's contained, and ideally you want a pile that's at least 3 by 3 by 3 feet, although it doesn't have to be. This is our setup, and we just kind of put together things we saw online for what we thought we would need. I absolutely wanted to keep pests out, so we added hardware cloth around each side. We also added a lid. You have to have really balanced moisture when you're hot composting, and we get a lot of rain, so this allows me better control over how much water is getting to that pile. I also wanted to have doors on the front. That makes flipping the piles a lot easier. I have a 2 bin setup, but if I could go back and change it, I would have made it 3. That way I could have 1 bin where I was collecting materials for hot composting, 1 where I was actively composting and flipping, and 1 where I was curing the compost. So maybe one day we'll build another one, but for right now this one works pretty well. So what are the things you'll actually be composting? In order for those microorganisms to break down that material, they need 3 things. They need food, water, and oxygen. First, let's talk about food. These are the materials you're putting into your compost pile, and they fall under 3 categories. The first group are your energy materials. These are also called nitrogens or greens, and these are things that are going to break down very quickly. They produce a lot of heat as they break down, and as the name implies, they're high in nitrogen. They include fresh grass clippings, coffee grounds, dairy, chicken, and rabbit manure, fruit and vegetable scraps, and garden trimmings. If you tried to make a compost pile with just greens, they would break down, but it would be really stinky and really slimy and messy. So we add other materials in with them. The next category are your bulking materials. These are also called browns, and they are much higher in carbon. Things like newspaper, cardboard, wood chips, hay, straw, and corn stalks. You can build a compost pile solely of these materials, but it would be super slow to break down, which is why we add in those greens to help speed up that process. The last category are balanced materials. These are things that are a good source of both nitrogen and carbon. These are things like leaves and ground up tree and shrub trimmings. Balanced materials can be composted well all on their own, or you can add them in with your greens and browns. And I'll list all of those below if you want to screenshot them or write them down. So how much of each material do you need? And honestly, there's a whole lot of different ratios that are recommended out there. It can be really confusing confusing for beginners. Most will say that you need like a 30-to-1 or a 15-to-1 or maybe even a 3-to-1 brown to green ratio, which means that you would want a lot more brown material than green. But honestly, I have found that because brown materials are a lot more bulky or tend to be a lot more bulky than green materials, if I'm just trying to eyeball those ratios, I end up with not near enough green to get my pile hot enough for hot composting. And a lot of the materials that we're adding aren't strictly pure carbon or pure nitrogen, they're a mixture of both. So what I have found works for me is I just try to add in about half brown, half green. Now if I'm adding in balanced material like leaves, you can add those in any amount. Now those microorganisms have their food source, now they need water. You want to keep compost piles moist but not dripping wet. If I'm starting a new compost pile, I like to add water as I'm building the layers. And the last thing those microorganisms need is oxygen. This is where flipping or turning your compost pile comes in. You can use a shovel, you can use a pitchfork. I like to use a compost crank, which I'll link below, but basically you're just trying to get the center of the pile to the outside. Now let's talk about the difference between cold composting and hot composting. The main pro of cold composting is it's easy and a lot less work. You basically just create your pile, alternating those different kinds of materials and wet it down. You can turn it every once in a while if you like, but not near as much as you'd have to do if you were hot composting. The cons are it takes a lot longer to produce finished compost, maybe even up to a year. And because it's not heating up, it may not be adequate enough to get rid of disease or weed seeds. Also with cold composting, you'll find that some materials will finish faster than others, so it's a good idea to occasionally sift that compost so you remove the finished compost, leaving the other materials to break down. With the hot composting method, you're producing finished compost a lot faster, but it does require more work. You'll need to flip the pile a lot more often. You'll also need to monitor those moisture levels, and you may need to keep adding more green material in order to keep that pile hot enough. But if you can keep it hot enough, it's a good method for getting rid of weed seeds and also helping to get rid of any diseases that were brought in with the material. When you're building a hot composting pile, again, you want to alternate those different kinds of materials, wetting it down as you go. With hot composting, the smaller the size of those materials, the faster it will compost. So you may want to run things like leaves or trimmings through a lawnmower or a shredder first. Use a compost thermometer and try to keep that pile between 120 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. When the pile has shrunk down to about half its volume, it should be finished, but it's a good idea to let that compost sit or cure anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks. Sorry, I had to scoot to get out of the sun. But let's briefly talk about trench composting because this is a great method for beginners. Trench composting you can do right in your garden. You basically just want to dig a trench anywhere from 6 to 12 inches deep, depending on what materials you're adding. Then just throw in those materials, cover them up, and let them sit. The microorganisms, the insects, the worms will break that material down. How long will just depend on what material you added. It will also depend on how rich your soil is with those beneficial insects. Now this is just me, but I avoid any plant trimmings that show signs of disease. I don't add any weeds that have gone to seed. I also don't add hay. Life gets busy. Sometimes I let these compost piles go cold, so I don't want to worry that I might be spreading disease or weed seeds or the seeds that are often present in hay to my garden. And last, I'll just address a few common issues you may have when composting. First is what to do if your compost pile stinks. Good compost should never stink. It should have a nice earthy smell to it. If it smells, you may have added too many of those green materials, or a lot of those green materials are just clumping together. It could also mean that your pile is too wet. First, just try flipping your pile every day for a few days and make sure it's not getting any additional water. If that doesn't work, then add in more of those brown materials. Another issue may be you're hot composting and that pile just won't stay hot. The first step would be to give those organisms what they need. Add in some greens, maybe some fresh grass clippings, turn the pile and add some water. It could also mean that your pile is just too small. That's why in hot composting it's recommended to have that 3 by 3 by 3 amount. It could also mean that your compost is finished. If most of that material looks broken down and your pile has shrunk by half, that might be the case. And the last common issue is animals getting in. This is where having a lid and that contained system will really help. But you also want to make sure that you're burying burying any food scraps down in the center of that pile. Rodents don't really like nesting in wet material, so if you're cold composting, just make sure you keep that pile wet. And there you go. That's everything you need to get started composting. If you have any additional questions, I am more than happy to answer them. Just comment below. Until then, don't forget to follow me on my other social medias where I create short, easy to follow gardening videos for beginners.